What if I told you that on a January morning in 1879, an army of barefoot warriors, armed with nothing but short spears, defeated the most powerful military force on the planet in less than 3 hours? Not with guns, not with cannons, but with tactics so brutal, so perfectly executed, that European generals would study them for decades to come. This isn't a myth. This isn't folklore whispered around campfires. This is the documented history of the Zulu warriors, a fighting force so fearsome that they transformed a small clan of 1,500 people into an empire that stretched across territory larger than France, all within a single generation. But here's what they don't teach you in history books. The methods used to create these warriors were so extreme, so disturbing, that even by the standards of their time, they shocked the world. Before we dive into this story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about survival, warfare, and the true cost of building an empire. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, because this tale of blood, innovation, and madness deserves to be heard across the globe. Today, we're peeling back the layers of one of history's most controversial military machines. We're going to explore the torture disguised as training, the genius hidden in brutality, and the thin line between strategic brilliance and complete insanity. By the end, you'll understand why the Zulu nation became both a symbol of resistance and a cautionary tale about the corruption of absolute power. Every monster has an origin story, and Shaka Zulu's began with rejection. Born in 1787 to an unwed mother, Shaka entered the world as an embarrassment. His father, Senzangakona, was the chief of a small Zulu clan, but his mother, Nandi, was not a legitimate wife. The Zulu word Shaka itself means intestinal beetle, a derogatory name given to suggest that Nandi's pregnancy was merely a stomach ailment. From his first breath, this child was unwanted. Imagine growing up where your very existence is considered a mistake. Young Shaka and his mother were expelled from the clan when he was just 6 years old. They wandered from tribe to tribe, seeking refuge, finding only more humiliation. The other children tormented him relentlessly. They mocked his illegitimacy, threw stones at him, excluded him from their games. But something was forming in that young boy's heart, something dark and unyielding. Every insult became fuel. Every beating became a lesson in survival. Every rejection carved deeper into his soul, creating not sadness, but an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Eventually, Shaka and his mother found sanctuary with Chief Dingiswayo of the Mthathwa people, and this is where the transformation truly began. Shaka possessed something that no amount of legitimate birth could provide: raw, terrifying talent. His physical strength was prodigious, his endurance seemed superhuman, but more importantly, he had a mind that saw warfare differently than anyone around him. Where others saw tradition and ceremony, he saw inefficiency and wasted potential. Under Dingiswayo's command, Shaka rose through the ranks with frightening speed. He became not just a warrior, but the warrior, the bravest, the most skilled, the most ruthless. Dingiswayo recognized this potential, and when Shaka's father died in 1816, the chief supported his claim to leadership of the Zulu clan. But there was one problem. Shaka's half-brother, Sigujana, had already assumed the throne. The confrontation was inevitable and swift. Shaka didn't negotiate. He didn't plead his case. He simply walked into his half-brother's kraal with cold determination and ended him. One thrust of a blade, and the outcast became the chief. But the throne wasn't Shaka's true goal. It was merely the beginning of something far more sinister. He looked at his small clan of 1,500 people and saw raw material. He would reshape them, rebuild them, and through methods that would make Spartan training look gentle, he would forge them into a weapon that would carve through Africa like a blade through flesh. But what he was about to do to his own people would haunt the continent for generations. Shaka's first act as chief was to declare war on weakness itself. He looked at the traditional Nguni way of warfare, the ritualistic throwing of spears from safe distances where nobody really got hurt, and he felt disgust. This wasn't combat, this was theater. And Shaka had no patience for performance when conquest was possible. His revolution began with the feet. It sounds simple, almost trivial, but what Shaka did to his warriors' feet became one of the most controversial aspects of his reign. He banned sandals completely. Every man under his command had to throw away their footwear and would never wear shoes again. The punishment for refusing? Immediate execution. No appeals, no mercy. But simply going barefoot wasn't enough. Shaka understood that feet accustomed to protection were soft, vulnerable, useless for the kind of warfare he envisioned. So he devised a training method that sounds more like medieval torture than military preparation. His warriors were forced to march across fields of thorns. They stamped on broken branches until their feet bled. They ran across scorching rocks and freezing streams until the skin hardened into something resembling leather. The logic was brutal but undeniable. Barefoot warriors were faster. They were more agile. They could feel the earth beneath them, sensing changes in terrain that gave them tactical advantages. Most importantly, they could cover distances that would exhaust any army burdened by heavy sandals. While enemies trudged along, the Zulu forces moved like shadows, appearing where they were least expected, striking before defenders could organize. But the suffering didn't end with their feet. Shaka instituted mandatory military service that lasted 15 years minimum. Young men were forbidden from marrying until they had washed their spears in enemy blood. Imagine that. A decade and a half of your youth spent in constant training, constant warfare, denied the basic human connection of family and love, all in service to one man's vision of dominance. The training regimen itself was relentless. Warriors ran dozens of miles daily, carrying full combat equipment. They practiced formations until the movements became instinctive. They learned to fight in synchronized units where individual heroics were punished and collective efficiency was praised. Shaka personally oversaw these drills, and his standards were impossibly high. A warrior who showed weakness during training might simply disappear overnight, a grim warning to the others. He also revolutionized their diet. Traditional Zulu meals were supplemented with massive quantities of meat, far beyond what was normal for the region. The reasoning was partly nutritional, providing protein for their extreme physical demands, but also psychological. Shaka believed that a diet heavy in flesh made men more aggressive, more willing to kill. Whether the science supported this or not, the belief itself became part of the warrior culture. By 1820, just 4 years after taking power, Shaka commanded an army of 40,000 warriors. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were a cult of violence, conditioned through pain and discipline to be the most effective fighting force Africa had ever seen. They could march 50 miles in a day and still fight a pitched battle at the end. They feared their own king more than they feared death itself, and they were about to be equipped with a weapon that would change everything. These methods weren't just harsh, they were a complete reconstruction of what it meant to be Zulu. But the physical transformation was only half the equation. Shaka needed to give his superhuman warriors a weapon worthy of their capabilities. Before Shaka, warfare in southern Africa followed a predictable pattern. Two groups of warriors would face each other from about 30 to 40 yards apart. Each man carried a long throwing spear called an assegai and a large cowhide shield. They would hurl their spears back and forth, most of which were easily dodged or blocked. When everyone ran out of spears, both sides would generally walk away. It was combat as ritual, a way to establish dominance without excessive bloodshed. Honor was maintained, stories were told, and life continued. Shaka saw this and felt nothing but contempt. What was the point of throwing away your weapon? What strategic sense did it make to fight from a distance when the goal was to eliminate your enemy? So he invented something new, something that would become synonymous with Zulu warfare, the iklwa. The iklwa was a short stabbing spear, about 3 feet in length, with a blade nearly a foot long and several inches wide. The name itself came from the sound it made when pulled from a human body. Iklwa. That sucking, tearing noise became the signature sound of Zulu conquest. Unlike the traditional throwing spear, this weapon was designed for close combat, for personal, brutal efficiency. But the weapon alone wasn't revolutionary. It was how Shaka taught his warriors to use it that changed everything. The technique was simple and horrifying. A Zulu warrior would charge his opponent using his large shield not just for protection, but as an offensive weapon. He would hook the edge of his shield behind the enemy's shield and yank it aside, exposing the opponent's torso. In that split second of vulnerability, the iklwa would thrust forward, driving deep into the chest or abdomen. Quick, efficient, lethal, Shaka instituted a rule that became sacred law. No Zulu warrior would return from battle with a bloodless spear. If you went to war and your iklwa wasn't stained red, you were executed. This wasn't about encouraging bravery. This was about ensuring that every single warrior became a killer, that the psychological barrier against taking human life was obliterated through constant, mandatory practice. The psychological impact of this weapon system cannot be overstated. Imagine being an enemy warrior, watching this wave of barefoot fighters charging toward you with unusual speed. You throw your spear, maybe you hit one, maybe you don't, then they're on you. Your traditional fighting style, the safe distance you relied on, is suddenly meaningless. You're face to face with a man whose sole purpose is to hook your shield aside and drive steel through your ribs. The terror was overwhelming, but Shaka added one more element that pushed his army from merely effective to absolutely devastating: the rule of no prisoners. Other African kingdoms would take captives, integrate conquered peoples, show mercy to those who surrendered. Not Shaka. His instructions were clear and consistently enforced. Fight until every enemy warrior is dead. Chase down those who flee. Show no mercy. Accept no surrender. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, though Shaka certainly had sadistic tendencies. It was strategic. Word spread quickly that fighting the Zulus meant certain death. There was no option to retreat and regroup, no chance to surrender and survive. You either won or you died. This psychological warfare broke enemy morale before battles even began. Many groups fled at the first sight of Zulu warriors, abandoning their lands without a fight. The iklwa transformed the Zulu military from a tribal militia into a killing machine. But even the most efficient weapon is useless without brilliant tactics to deploy it. And Shaka had developed something that would make military historians marvel for centuries. Military genius often lies not in individual skill, but in how you organize violence. Shaka understood this intuitively. The weapon was one thing, but the formation, the strategy, the choreography of death, that's what elevated the Zulus from effective to unstoppable. He called it the Impondo Zenkomo, the horns of the buffalo. To European observers who later studied it, this formation seemed almost impossibly sophisticated for a supposedly primitive people. But there was nothing primitive about it. It was a masterclass in tactical warfare that combined speed, psychology, and brutal efficiency. The formation divided the army into 4 distinct groups, each with a specific role. The chest or skull formed the center, composed of the most experienced warriors, the veterans who had proven themselves in multiple campaigns. These men would engage the enemy head-on, absorbing the initial assault and holding the line no matter what. Their job wasn't to win the battle. It was to keep the enemy focused and engaged. The horns extended from either side of the chest, and this is where Shaka placed his youngest, fastest warriors. Speed and agility were everything for these units. While the chest engaged the enemy frontally, the horns would sprint around the flanks at full speed, using their barefoot advantage to navigate rough terrain that would slow down normal armies. Their objective was simple: get behind the enemy and close the trap. The loins or reserves stayed at the rear, and here's where it gets interesting. These were the oldest warriors, men past their prime but still formidable. Shaka would often order them to sit with their backs to the battle. Why? Because these veterans knew combat. They knew the rush of adrenaline, the temptation to charge in without orders. By forcing them to face away, Shaka prevented premature engagement. They couldn't see the battle, couldn't get excited, couldn't break formation. They would join the fight only when explicitly commanded, usually to deliver the final blow or pursue fleeing enemies. The genius of this formation wasn't just in its design, but in its execution. While encirclement tactics existed throughout military history, the Zulus performed it with frightening speed and coordination. From the moment of engagement to complete encirclement often took less than an hour. Enemies would realize too late that the frontal assault they were fighting was just a distraction. By the time they heard the war cries from behind, by the time they turned to see the horns closing in, they were already doomed. But there was another layer to this tactic that made it psychologically devastating. The Zulus didn't just surround and kill, they created chaos. Warriors would shout, beat their shields, make the most horrifying sounds imaginable. They would appear and disappear through tall grass, making their numbers seem even larger than they were. They turned battlefields into theaters of psychological terror where the enemy broke mentally before they were broken physically. Training for this formation was constant and exhaustive. Warriors drilled the movements until they could execute them while exhausted, at night, in unfamiliar terrain. Officers communicated through a system of signals that allowed for mid-battle adjustments. If one horn was struggling, reinforcements from the loins could be deployed with precision. If the chest needed to give ground to draw the enemy in deeper, they could do so in an organized retreat that didn't break formation. The difference between the Zulus and other armies wasn't just technique, it was discipline. It was the hundreds of hours of training that made complex maneuvers feel natural. It was the absolute obedience to commanders that came from knowing disobedience meant death. And it was the physical conditioning that allowed warriors to execute these tactics at full speed after marching all day. This formation would soon unleash consequences that would devastate southern Africa in ways no one, not even Shaka himself, could fully anticipate. The buffalo was about to stampede across the continent, and in its wake would come migrations, massacres, and a period of chaos that people would remember as the Great Crushing. Within 4 years of taking power, Shaka controlled territory comparable in size to France. Let that sink in. In less time than it takes to complete a college degree, one man and his barefoot army conquered an area vast enough to contain millions of people, but conquest was just the beginning. What Shaka did with that conquered territory created ripples of violence that spread across southern Africa like poison in water. His policy was devastatingly simple. When Zulu forces overwhelmed a tribe, which they almost always did, the elderly were killed immediately. They were considered useless, unable to fight or adapt, and Shaka had no patience for feeding mouths that couldn't contribute to his war machine. The young, however, were given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join the Zulu nation completely or die. Complete integration meant erasing your past. You would abandon your birth name and take a Zulu name. You would stop speaking your native language and speak only Zulu. You would forget your clan's history, your ancestors, your traditions. You would become Zulu in every way that mattered. For those who accepted, the transformation was total. They weren't treated as conquered peoples or second-class citizens. They were full Zulu warriors, expected to fight with the same ferocity as those born into the tribe. For those who refused, death was swift and certain. But here's what makes this period so catastrophic. Many tribes chose a third option: flight. They would hear stories of the Zulu army approaching, stories of the barefoot warriors who showed no mercy, and they would flee before the confrontation ever happened. But when you're a tribe of thousands suddenly moving through territory that belongs to other people, you become both refugee and invader. These fleeing tribes would attack their neighbors, not out of conquest ambition, but out of desperate need for food, water, and shelter. Those neighbors would then flee, attacking their neighbors in turn. It was a domino effect of violence, a chain reaction of displacement and death that spread far beyond Shaka's direct control. Historians call this period the Mfecane, which translates roughly to the crushing or the scattering. The numbers are staggering and disputed, but conservative estimates suggest up to 2 million people died during this period. Some were killed by Zulu warriors. Many more died in the chaos that followed, victims of the migrations and conflicts triggered by Shaka's expansion. Villages that had stood for generations were abandoned. Fertile lands became no man's lands, too dangerous to inhabit. Ethnic groups that had distinct identities for centuries were absorbed into larger nations or simply ceased to exist. The demographic map of southern Africa was redrawn entirely, and the effects are still visible today. Shaka himself commanded an army that peaked around 100,000 warriors, with another 500,000 in reserve from conquered tribes. His reach extended from the Drakensberg Mountains to the shores of the Indian Ocean. He had transformed a clan of 1,500 into an empire. But here's the dark irony. While Shaka was creating this empire through force, another empire was watching with growing interest. The British Empire had established a presence on the coast, and they were very curious about this African Napoleon who was creating such chaos in the interior. By the late 1872s, more than 4 decades after Shaka's death, His military innovations had become Zulu tradition. The warriors still fought with short spears. They still trained barefoot. They still used the buffalo head formation. And when the British decided that the Zulu kingdom had become inconvenient to their colonial ambitions, they learned a lesson that would shock the entire Victorian world. January 22nd, 1879. The place is called Isandlwana, named after a hill that supposedly resembles a cow in the Zulu language. Lord Chelmsford, commanding the British forces in South Africa, had divided his army to pursue what he believed was the main Zulu force. He left behind about 1,700 men to guard the camp, a mix of British regulars and local auxiliaries. These soldiers had the most modern weapons of the age. Martini Henry rifles that could fire 11 rounds per minute with accuracy up to 400 yards, artillery that could tear through massed formations. The technological advantage seemed overwhelming. What Lord Chelmsford didn't know was that 20,000 Zulu warriors were hidden in the valleys nearby, and they had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. The British had made a fatal mistake. Despite established military doctrine, despite warnings from scouts who reported Zulu presence in the area, Chelmsford had not ordered the camp fortified. No defensive perimeter, no wagon laager, no trenches. The soldiers were essentially camping in the open, confident that their firepower would be sufficient. Around mid-morning, British cavalry scouts, pursuing a small group of Zulus, rode over a ridge and suddenly found themselves staring at the main Zulu army. Thousands upon thousands of warriors, organized in their traditional formation, sitting silently in the valley. The scouts immediately raced back to camp, but by then it was too late. The Zulus were already moving. The buffalo head formation deployed with the precision of a military machine. The chest, composed of the UMCJO, Ukandam and other veteran regiments, advanced toward the British center. The right horn swept wide to the north, the left horn to the south. Within minutes, the British found themselves engaged on three sides, and their confidence began to crack. The British lines held initially. The Martini Henry rifles cut down Zulus by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Artillery shells exploded in the advancing formations, tearing gaps that were immediately filled by more warriors. But the Zulus kept coming. They absorbed casualties that would break any European army and continued their advance with terrifying determination. The horns reached their positions and began to close. Now the British were surrounded, and their technological advantage started to matter less. Rifles need time to reload. Artillery needs space to operate. But the Zulus were inside their range, mixing with the defenders, and suddenly it was iklwa against bayonet, shield against rifle butt. This was the kind of fighting the Zulus had trained for their entire lives. The battle lasted less than 3 hours from first contact to final massacre. 1,300 British and colonial soldiers died. 52 officers, more than fell at Waterloo. The Zulus had achieved what seemed impossible, a complete military victory against a modern European army. They lost about 2,000 warriors, a heavy toll, but they had proven that tactics, training, and determination could overcome technological superiority. When Lord Chelmsford returned to the camp that evening, he found a scene of absolute carnage. Bodies everywhere, equipment destroyed, supplies looted. The entire column had been annihilated. The news reached London and caused political earthquakes. How could this happen? How could savages with spears defeat the army of the British Empire? The answer was simple, though proud Victorian minds struggled to accept it. The Zulus weren't savages. They were professional soldiers with generations of tactical knowledge, fighting on their home terrain, led by commanders who understood warfare at a fundamental level. Isandlwana wasn't a fluke. It was the inevitable result of underestimating an enemy who had perfected the art of war through decades of constant combat. The British response was predictable. They sent 10,000 more troops, and over the following months, through sheer numerical and technological superiority, they crushed the Zulu kingdom. The Zulus won the battle, but lost the war. By 1887, their kingdom had been officially annexed, divided into 13 territories, their power broken forever. But the victory at Isandlwana remains one of the most remarkable military achievements in history. It proved that Shaka's innovations, the brutal training, the psychological conditioning, the tactical brilliance, weren't just effective against African adversaries. They could work against anyone. Yet while military historians celebrated this achievement, they often overlooked the darkest chapter of Shaka's story. The battle at Isandlwana happened 50 years after Shaka's death. What happened in his final years revealed that the man who built this incredible military machine was descending into something far more horrifying than any battlefield could produce. Power doesn't corrupt gradually. Sometimes it happens all at once, triggered by a single event that cracks the foundation of sanity. For Shaka, that event came in October 1827 when his mother, Nandi, died. She was the only person he had ever truly loved, the woman who had protected him during his years of exile and humiliation. She was known as the Great Elephant, respected and feared almost as much as Shaka himself. And when she passed, something inside him shattered completely. The mourning period that followed wasn't grief, it was genocide. Shaka declared that the entire nation would mourn with him, but his definition of proper mourning was insane. He ordered that no crops could be planted for a year, no milk could be drunk. Married couples were forbidden from living together. Anyone who didn't show sufficient grief would be executed, and Shaka's definition of sufficient grief was impossible to meet. On the first day alone, 7,000 people were killed. 7,000. Some sources claim he personally conducted executions, walking through crowds and pointing out those whose tears seemed insufficient. Others were trampled in the chaos as people desperately tried to demonstrate their sorrow, wailing and tearing at their clothes to avoid being marked as insufficiently mournful. There's even a darker rumor that persists in some historical accounts, though it's disputed. Some say that Nandi hadn't died of natural causes at all. They claim that she had tried to reason with Shaka, tried to make him see how his tyranny was destroying the nation he had built, and in a fit of rage, he had killed her himself. Then, overwhelmed by what he had done, he had created this elaborate mourning ritual to mask his own guilt. Whether this is true or propaganda spread by his enemies, we may never know. But the fact that the story exists at all tells you something about how his own people had come to view him. The year of mourning devastated the Zulu nation. Fields went unplanted during the growing season, ensuring famine. The forced separation of families disrupted the social fabric. The constant executions created an atmosphere of terror where no one felt safe. Warriors who had fought bravely in dozens of battles found themselves killed because their faces didn't show enough anguish. Children were orphaned, villages were decimated, and all of it was because one man couldn't process his grief without dragging an entire nation into his psychological collapse. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a growing pattern. Shaka had never married, never produced a legitimate heir, His relationships with women were reportedly dysfunctional at best, violent at worst. Some historians suggest he was incapable of emotional intimacy, that the childhood trauma of rejection had left him unable to form healthy bonds with anyone. His mother was the exception, and when she died, that last tether to humanity snapped. The paranoia intensified. He began to see plots everywhere, imagined enemies in every shadow. The warriors who had once revered him as a genius tactician now saw him as a dangerous madman. The chiefs who had pledged loyalty began to whisper among themselves. Even his own family, those who had benefited most from his rise to power, started to realize that Shaka had become a threat, not just to his enemies, but to the very nation he had created. The man who had revolutionized warfare, who had built an empire through strategic brilliance and uncompromising discipline, was now maintaining power through random violence and irrational decrees. And everyone knew that this couldn't continue. The question wasn't whether Shaka would fall. The question was who would have the courage to push him. September 1828. Shaka was preparing for another military campaign, though by this point, his military objectives had become unclear even to his closest advisors. The rational conquests of his early reign had given way to campaigns that seemed motivated purely by the need for violence, for something to distract from the emptiness inside him. The conspiracy had been forming for months, whispered conversations between people who all shared the same realization: Shaka had to die. The key figures were his half-brothers, Dingane and Mfecane, men who had their own ambitions for leadership. His aunt, Mkabayi, lent her support, a woman who had once been one of Shaka's strongest allies, but who now saw him as a threat to the Zulu nation's survival. Even Mbopa, one of Shaka's most trusted servants, had turned against him. The execution was shockingly simple for such a momentous event. As Shaka met with some representatives, the conspirators approached. Dingane struck first, driving a blade into Shaka's side. Mfecane followed with another thrust. Mbopa delivered what was likely the killing blow. The man who had been called the Napoleon of Africa, who had transformed warfare across an entire continent, died in a matter of seconds, betrayed by those closest to him. There was no grand battle, no final stand, just a quick, brutal end that mirrored the thousands of deaths he had ordered throughout his reign. According to some accounts, his last words were prophetic. "Are you stabbing me, kings of the earth? You will come to an end through killing one another." Whether he actually said this, or whether it was added later to give narrative weight to his death, we'll never know. But the sentiment proved eerily accurate. Dingane took power and immediately began consolidating control through the same violent methods Shaka had used. The Zulu kingdom continued, but the chaos of succession and internal conflicts weakened it significantly. When the British finally invaded in 1879, the kingdom fell relatively quickly despite their victory at Isandlwana. By 1887, the proud nation that Shaka had built was officially annexed, divided, and absorbed into the colonial structure. But Shaka's legacy didn't die with annexation. It couldn't. What he had created was too profound, too controversial, too multifaceted to simply disappear. Today, he remains one of the most debated figures in African history. To some, he's a hero, an anti-colonial warrior who united disparate tribes and created a military force capable of defeating European armies. They point to Isandlwana as proof that African military genius could match anything Europe produced. To others, he's a monster, a tyrant whose methods of conquest and control were as brutal as any colonial force. They point to the Mfecane, to the 2 million deaths, to the forced assimilation that destroyed hundreds of distinct cultural groups. They note that while he resisted European colonialism, he practiced his own form of imperialism that was arguably just as destructive. The truth, as always, is more complex. Shaka was both and neither. He was a product of his time, a man shaped by childhood trauma who channeled that pain into military innovation. He was a tactical genius who revolutionized warfare but couldn't control his own psychological demons. He built a nation and nearly destroyed it. He created a legacy of resistance that inspired generations, but also a legacy of violence that haunted the continent. The Zulu kingdom survived in diminished form until apartheid and beyond. Today, there's still a Zulu king, though his role is largely ceremonial. The Zulu people remain one of the largest ethnic groups in South Africa, and Shaka Day is celebrated every September 24th. But the celebration is complicated, marked by ongoing debates about whether they're honoring a liberator or a dictator. Military historians still study the Buffalo Head Formation. Anthropologists still debate the effectiveness of his training methods. Psychologists analyze how childhood trauma shaped his leadership style, and everyone who learns his story is forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between genius and madness, between necessary brutality and psychopathic violence, between building a nation and destroying countless others in the process. So we've journeyed from a rejected child to an emperor, from a small clan of 1,500 to a nation of 250,000. We've seen how extreme training methods, how feet hardened on thorns and minds hardened through violence, created warriors capable of defeating the most powerful army on Earth. We've witnessed tactical innovations that changed African warfare forever and influenced military thinking worldwide. But we've also seen the cost: the 2 million dead in the Mfecane, the 7,000 executed for insufficient grief, the psychological destruction of a man who couldn't escape his childhood trauma, the cycle of violence that continued long after Shaka's death, the forced erasure of cultures and languages and identities in service of a unified Zulu nation. Here's the question I want to leave you with, the one that historians still debate and that doesn't have a simple answer. Were these extreme methods necessary? Could Shaka have created a military force capable of resisting European colonialism without the torture disguised as training, without the genocidal conquests, without descending into tyrannical madness? Or was this brutality the inevitable cost of building something strong enough to stand against empires? Some argue that in a brutal world, only brutal methods succeed, that Shaka did what was necessary to protect his people from colonization, and the fact that the Zulu kingdom survived decades longer than many African nations vindicated his approach. Others counter that his methods ultimately weakened the kingdom through internal division and moral corruption, making it easier for the British to conquer. Maybe the real lesson isn't about whether Shaka was a hero or a villain. Maybe it's about what happens when pain becomes power, when survival tactics become identity, when the methods we use to protect ourselves become the very things that destroy us. Shaka survived his traumatic childhood by becoming harder, colder, more willing to inflict pain than anyone around him. And he taught an entire nation to do the same. They survived, they thrived for a time. But at what cost to their humanity? Think about that the next time someone tells you that the ends justify the means, or that great achievements require great sacrifices. Ask yourself, whose sacrifices and who gets to decide that they're necessary? Until next time, keep questioning everything you think you know about history. The stories we're told are never as simple as they seem.